Hello everyone. Today we are going to look at Hecksher-Ohlin theory of factor endowments. Now first of all, what do you mean by factor endowments? It's the amount of labor, land, money and entrepreneurship which are the factors of production that are used or for exploited for manufacture within a country, the availability of factors of production in any country. And according to Heckscher-Ohlin theory, the causes of trade between two countries is differences in factor endowments. Please understand this, very important. Differences in factor endowments and differences in factor prices. Yes, so some countries have more capital, others have more labor. For example, USA. USA has more capital, so and India has more labor. So whenever these differences are there between two countries, it will they will enter into a trade. Yes, the main cause of trade between regions is differences in prices of commodities, means factor prices, relative on factor prices and factor endowments. Yes, now assumptions you can read from ML Jingan's book on page number 857. Okay, I have already uploaded the material, study material for this. Now on page number 58 and 59 there are two important diagrams that you have to draw in the exam. Okay, and these are very easy diagrams, but you have to learn them slow by slow. Okay, and one thing is always draw a bigger diagram. Yes, don't restrict yourself within a short space. Yes, so first we will draw x and y axis. This is y axis, this is x axis. Yes, and always write what you are measuring on x and y axis. On x axis we are going to measure labor, amount of labor, and on y axis we are going to measure capital. Yes, amount of capital. As you go up this side, capital increases, and you go right, labor increases. Yes, and here labor becomes 0 at this point, and here if you go down capital becomes 0. That's very basic. Yes, now we will draw two things you need to understand before going to draw this diagram. Those are isocont and isocost. Isocont. Isocont is nothing but different combinations of capital and labor that give same output. Yes, and another thing you need to understand is isocost. Isocont is same like indifference curve, just indifference curve is from the point of view of consumer, isocont is from the point of view of producer. Now isocost is different combinations of input that can be purchased that can be purchased for an estimated cost. Yes, the cost of purchasing inputs, that is ISO cost line. It's just like budget line. Yes, from the point of view of a producer. Okay, now we will draw two ISO yes, x and y axis. Everyone understood? Now we will draw two isoconts, xx for commodity x, xx for commodity x, xx for commodity x, and I will use another color for y for commodity y. Okay, simple. Now they are both similar for both the countries, for country A and country B also. Yes. Now the relative factor prices in country A for both the commodities are given by factor price line AA. Now we will draw a factor price line, means ISO cost line. ISO cost line is also called as factor price line. Factor price line. Now we will draw for country A. काकू काकू थोड़ा आवाज. Yes, and this is the ISO cost line for country A, denoted by A1. Okay, now नंतर करा. Assuming that each isocont represent one unit of respective commodity, then one unit of Y will be produced with at this point. In order to produce one unit of Y, we will at point E, in order to produce one unit of Y, it will require yes, in order to produce one unit of Y, it will require OD. This is the OD, amount of labor, and OC, amount of capital. Always remember from this, OD, amount of labor, and OC, amount of capital. Now you can see here, in order to produce one unit of Y, capital OC, is required, and labor OD is required. You can see from the diagram which is higher, OC. Yes. Now, and in order to produce one unit of X, this should be here. Yes, perfect. In order to produce one unit of X, how much it is requiring? It is requiring at point G, or let's say L, you require how much amount of 1 unit of y, you require OC amount of, and 1x you require OM amount of labor, and OM amount of capital and ON amount of labor. So you can see here capital is, labor is more used, yes, in order to produce 1 unit of X. Since capital is more and cheap in country A, it will specialize in the production of capital intensive commodity Y. A will produce Y. Yes, A will produce Y. Yes, and since in order to produce 1 unit of Y, it uses more amount of capital OC with ODE labor at point E on the isocount YY. Yes, hence country A will produce and export. Country A will produce. They will not produce this. They will not produce this. No. Why no? Because country A is capital intensive. Yes, and specializing in that, particularly that they can produce capital intensive good, and they will export at point E. They will produce at point E, and they will also export commodity Y. Okay, now we will look from the point of view of country B. I hope this is clear. First part of the diagram. Okay, now we will look at what will happen from the point of view in country B. Okay, where labor is relatively cheap. A similar factor price line B2 is drawn parallel to, first you need to draw a flatter factor price line. A flatter factor price line. Yes. And we will use color red for this. Okay, this is the flatter factor price line, and at point G, let's say here, let's move this little bit upward. Yes, at point G here, country B is producing at point G, it is producing OK amount of capital and OH amount of, yes. Now we are looking it from the point of view of country B, yes, which is labor abundant country. Always remember, country B is labor abundant country. So in order to produce 1 unit of Y, they require OK amount of capital and OH amount of labor. Yes, country. Now we will draw a similar, a parallel line, yes, to the isocost line, this isocost line B, we will draw a similar isocost line which will give us a similar slope. Yes, yes. And now this line is tangent to isocost isocont line xx at point S. Now it requires OT amount of capital, OT amount of capital, and OR amount of labor. Yes, at point here, at G, at point G, it require OK amount of capital and OH amount of labor. At point S, it requires OT amount of capital and OR amount of labor. Yes, now since labor is cheap and abundant in country B, it will specialize. It will specialize in the production of labor intensive commodity, and it will produce commodity X at point S, and country B will export labor intensive commodity. Understood till now? Yes. Now we will look at another part of the diagram. I hope this is clear now. Yes, go step by step like I have done. Yes, go step by step. Then another diagram is factor abundance in physical term. This is simple diagram. In physical terms. Yes, again draw X and Y axis. Yes, in order to produce yes, X and Y axis, and yes, now here in this diagram we will understand what do you mean by capital abundant if the country is endowed with a higher proportion of capital than other country. Yes, now here we will require a production possibility curve. Yes, combination of labor and capital. Commodity X is measured on X axis and commodity Y is measured on Y axis. Okay, now the line OR line shows 45 degrees line, means what? In order to produce 1 unit of X, in order to produce let's say 1 unit of X, it will require 1 unit of Y. In order to produce 4 units of X, it will take 4 units of Y. Yes, so the OR line is shows the proportionate, this equal proportionate line. Yes, now we will draw production possibility curve. Just a second. Yes. A A1 is production possibility curve of country A, and B1 is production possibility curve of country B. Okay. Now we will need to draw the slopes of these two curves show that commodity Y is capital intensive and commodity X is labor intensive. Yes, the slopes of this curve, if you look closely, you will get to know the slopes of this curve is showing that country A is capital intensive and country B is labor intensive. Just a second. And practice these curves, then only you will understand how to draw this in the exam. Yes, I have already told you what do you mean by OR line. If country A and B produce both commodities in the same proportion, they will produce along the ray or line OR. Yes, when both produce at their respective points, country A will produce at point E. This is point E. Where factor price line ST touches the production possibility curve AA dash. Now, yes, this is for country AA dash. We will use green line for this. Yes, A dash. It will produce more of commodity Y. More of commodity Y means if you draw a factor price line and name it, you will able to understand country A is producing at point E, and if you draw a slope green line, you will understand the in order to produce in order at point E, A will produce OS amount of commodity Y and OT amount of commodity X, which is now at point E. At E, it is producing OS of commodity Y and OT of commodity X. Yes, now OS is greater than OT. Now similarly, country B is producing at point F, and if you draw a slope, it will show you yes, this is the isocost line for country B, and country B is producing at point F. At F, it is producing OK amount of commodity Y and OR amount of commodity X. And since from this figure you can see OR is greater than OK, so country A will export capital intensive good since it is producing more on Y axis, and country B will export labor intensive good since it is producing on x-axis. Okay, now I have explained these two diagrams step by step. Yes, draw these diagrams 3-4 times, and then you will be able to understand, and you will able to understand it how to draw iso cost line, how, what, in what shape you have to draw it. Then only it will give you a perfect diagram. Okay, if you have any doubts you can contact me. Thank you.